The table went quiet, the way tables go quiet when someone has just said something that cannot be unsaid. My brother had been making the joke for 3 minutes. The kind of joke that isn't really a joke, the kind that has a point inside it, wrapped in enough lightness that you're not supposed to object without sounding like you can't take a bit of fun. He had been doing what I always do in those moments, which is smile in the direction of my plate and wait for the subject to change. Then Wren Calloway put down her fork. She did not raise her voice. She did not make a scene. She looked at my brother with the particular patience of a woman who has decided quietly and without apology that something is going to stop. And then she said something that made my mother set down her wine glass, made my brother forget the punchline he had been building toward, and made me understand, in the space of about 4 seconds, that I had been wrong about Wren Calloway for a very long time. No one at the table was ready for it, including me, especially me. My name is James Calloway. I am 33. I know, same last name. That is not a mistake, and it is not the story I am telling, though it is the reason this is complicated. I am a structural engineer for a firm that does mostly bridge and infrastructure work. The job is precise and quiet and involves a great deal of looking at things other people drive over without thinking about. I am good at it. I am less good at dinner parties, family gatherings, and any social situation that requires me to talk about myself without immediately deflecting towards something technical. My therapist calls this a pattern. I call it a preference. I live in a terrace house 20 minutes from my parents. I run in the mornings. I make decent pasta and bad coffee. And I own exactly one houseplant, which my friend Marcus has twice tried to rescue and twice returned in worse condition than he found it. Her name was Wren. Wren Calloway, my brother's last name too, because she had married into it 6 years ago and divorced back out of it 3 years after that. She had kept the name because, as she once told me at a Christmas gathering that I had been trying to leave for 40 minutes, changing it back felt like admitting the whole thing had been a mistake, and she had decided it had just been a different kind of education. She was 30. She worked as a secondary school art teacher and freelanced illustration work on weekends. She had paint on her hands at approximately 70% of the gatherings I had attended with her, and she had a silver ring on her right hand. Not a wedding ring, she had been clear about that. Just a ring that she turned between her fingers when she was thinking. I had noticed the ring approximately the third time I had seen her. He had noticed a great many things about Wren Calloway that I had told myself with considerable conviction were entirely irrelevant. The existing dynamic was this. She was my brother's ex-wife. She remained inexplicably and with a persistence that I had watched my mother quietly approve of for 3 years, part of the family. She came to Christmases. She came to birthdays. She came to Sunday dinners when she was between school terms, and my mother invited her, which was often. My brother had moved on. New partner, new life, no apparent difficulty with the arrangement. Wren had moved on in the sense that she seemed genuinely unbothered, which I had chosen to interpret as evidence that she had her life precisely as she wanted it. I had not moved on in the sense that I was trying to move anywhere. I had simply been having Sunday dinners at my parents' table every 3 weeks for 2 years, sitting across from Wren Calloway, and telling myself that what I felt when she laughed at something I said was gratitude for the company. I have a limited gift for self-deception. I had been stretching it further than it was designed to go. The dinner in question was a Sunday in March. My parents' house, which smells of old books and the specific lavender candle my mother has been buying from the same shop for 15 years. 7 people around the table. My parents, my brother Dan, his partner Celia, my aunt who visits from Bristol every few months and asks the same questions about my love life with the dedicated consistency of a researcher, Wren, and me. It had been fine until the roast. It is often fine until the roast. The subject of my work had come up, a project I had been leading, a railway bridge in the Midlands, something I had spent 18 months on and was genuinely proud of. My aunt had asked about it with the polite interest of someone who does not understand structural engineering and is not planning to start. I had explained it briefly, which was a mistake, because brevity in my family reads as modesty, and modesty in my family is an invitation. Dan had leaned back in his chair. He had done the thing he does, the slow smile, the pause, the performance of a man who has thought of something funny that everyone is going to enjoy. James is very good at being the most interesting thing no one's ever heard of, he said. 17 years I've been telling people what my brother does and watching their eyes go. It could make anything sound like a tax return. There was laughter. Polite laughter, family laughter, the kind that acknowledges a joke without endorsing it too hard. My mother smiled in a way that meant she was going to steer the conversation somewhere else in approximately 30 seconds. Dan kept going. He always kept going. Remember the dinner party at Marcus's? James spent 45 minutes explaining load distribution to someone who was just trying to get to the kitchen. She cited was the most educational excuse to leave a conversation she'd ever had. More laughter. My aunt joined in now. My father was looking at his plate in the way he looks at his plate when he agrees with something but doesn't want to say so out loud. I was smiling. I was very good at smiling. I had been smiling at this particular category of joke for 29 of my 33 years. Ren had been quiet. I registered this the way you register weather, peripherally without assigning meaning. She was often quiet at these dinners, thoughtful, watching. He had assumed she was somewhere else in her head. She was not somewhere else in her head. She put down her fork. The small click of it against the plate was louder than it should have been. Not aggressive, just deliberate. The sound of a person setting something down because they have decided to use their hands for something else. She sighed. Actually, I don't think that's right. The table paused. Dan looked at her with the expression of a man who has not been interrupted mid-joke in recent memory. Sorry? Ren picked up her wine glass but didn't drink from it. She turned it once. The Midlands Railway Bridge, I've been reading about it. The project. There was a beat in which no one said anything. The Heritage Rail Trust put out a piece about it last month, she said. The engineering team found a way to restore the original Victorian ironwork instead of replacing it. The cost saving was significant, but the reason they did it was structural integrity. The new material would have had a different expansion coefficient. James flagged it, apparently, early enough that the whole approach changed. She looked at my brother with the kind of patience that is its own form of pressure. So the interesting thing about what he does is not that it sounds boring, it's that nobody's wheel falls off a bridge on the way home. The silence that followed was not the comfortable kind. My aunt said, somewhat faintly, "Oh, Dan recovered first," which he always does. "Fair enough," he said, in the tone of a man conceding a point while filing it away to revisit at a later date. It reached for the bread. The conversation moved on with the efficient self-repair of long-practiced family dynamics. I looked at Ren. She was looking at her plate. A small color had risen along her cheekbones, the way it does in a person who has done something on impulse and is now assessing the consequences. She picked up her fork again. She did not look up. That sentence did something quiet to the room. After dinner in the kitchen, she was rinsing glasses while I loaded the dishwasher. This is a task we had, without ever planning to, fallen into doing together at these dinners. The kind of parallel domestic rhythm that develops between people who have been in the same spaces enough times that the logistics arrange themselves. I said, "You read the Heritage Rail piece." She sighed. "I read a lot of things." I said that was a very specific thing to have read. She handed me a wine glass without looking at it. "Your mom forwarded me a link when the project was announced. She thought I'd be interested." I said, "Did she?" She sighed. "She sends me things occasionally about what you're working on." I set the glass down on the wrong rack and had to move it. "I am not typically clumsy in kitchens," I said, Ren. She sighed. I said, "Thank you for what you said." She went still for a moment. Then she handed me another glass. "It needed saying." I said, "You didn't have to say it." She sighed. "I know." She did look at me then, briefly, the way she looks at things she is in the process of deciding about. The silver ring turned once between her fingers. She looked away first. He drove home that night and sat in my car in my own driveway for 11 minutes before going inside. This is not typical behavior for me. I am not usually a man who sits in parked cars. I thought about the fact that my mother had been forwarding Ren Calloway links about my work. I thought about the fact that Ren had been reading them. I thought about the specific quality of attention required to read a Heritage Rail Trust piece thoroughly enough to recall the expansion coefficient detail at a Sunday dinner table, 3 weeks after it was published, and to recall it in a way that was not a performance, but simply a correction. The kind of correction a person makes when they are tired of watching something be misrepresented. He thought about the ring turning between her fingers. I thought about the fact that she had been coming to these dinners for 3 years, since the divorce, with my mother's persistent and unmistakable approval. I thought about the fact that my mother is not a woman who does things without a reason. He thought about the 45-minute conversation at Marcus's dinner party that Dan had mentioned, the one I had apparently spent explaining load distribution. I remembered it differently. He remembered Ren, sitting at the end of the kitchen counter, asking follow-up questions that were not small-talk questions. And the person who had been trying to get to the kitchen had not been leaving the conversation at all. She had been trying to get past it to refill her glass. She had come back. He sat in my car, and I understood, with the slow and slightly winded clarity of a man who has been not looking at something for 2 years, that I had been very wrong about a great many things. She texted me on Tuesday. I know because I have the timestamp. The text said, "My year Dians want to know how bridges stay up." I told him to ask someone who knows. Is there any chance you'd do a 20-minute talk sometime this term? No obligation. He stared at it for 3 minutes. My domestic habits are not threatening in the way that, say, a man who texts back in under a minute's domestic habits are threatening. He texted back after 4 minutes. I said yes. She replied, "Thank you. They'll ask terrible questions." I said, "I like terrible questions." She said, "I know. I read that text 3 times. I know because I remember reading it 3 times." She knows. Not "I thought you would" or "I figured." I know. The way a person says it when they have been paying attention to something for long enough that it has become information. He went to the school 3 weeks later on a Wednesday afternoon. The year 10s were, as promised, chaotic. They asked whether bridges could be hacked, whether earthquakes could be designed to target specific buildings, and whether I had ever had to evacuate a structure. They were genuinely interested in the answers. One of them asked if I had ever gotten a bridge wrong, and when I said yes, in the early part of my career, a calculation error that was caught by a colleague before any construction began. The room went very quiet in the way rooms go quiet when young people are listening to something true. Ren stood at the back of the classroom with her arms folded and her silver ring turning between her fingers and a look on her face that I had not seen before. She was watching me the way a person watches something they are proud of, but trying not to show. She looked away too quickly when I caught it. After the class, in the corridor while the students filed out, she said, "You were good with them." I said, "They were good questions." She said, "You told them about the mistake." I said, "It was relevant." She sighed, "Most people wouldn't have. Most people in that position would have made themselves the answer, not the process." I said, "The process is the point. If I make myself the answer, they'll think they have to be perfect to do it. That's not useful." She looked at me with the ring still between her fingers, and the color that had come up at the dinner table 2 weeks ago visible again, just slightly along the line of her jaw. She sighed, "See, that's the thing." I said, "What thing?" She sighed, "Nothing," and picked up the tote bag she'd left on the floor. And I have poor survival instincts around women who start sentences they decide not to finish. I called my mother that evening. I am not a person who calls without reason. My mother answered with the tone of a woman who has been expecting this particular call for approximately 2 years. I said, "You've been sending Ren articles about my work." She said, "She asked me to." There was a silence. I said, "She asked you." My mother said, "She asked about a year ago whether there was anything she could read to understand what you actually do." She sighed. She felt embarrassed that she'd been at all those dinners and couldn't explain your job to someone if they asked. I sent her a few things. She paused. I may have continued sending things. I said, "For a year." She said, "For a year." I said, "Mum." She said, "James," in the precise tone of a woman who is done pretending she hasn't noticed something. He went to the school the following Friday because I had left my jacket in the lost and found, which was the kind of transparently constructed reason to be somewhere that I was not proud of, but was not going to examine too carefully. She was in her classroom at the end of the day, with the overhead lights off and the late afternoon light coming through the high windows, and paint on her hands, blue this time. The particular blue of something she had been working on that mattered to her. She looked up when I appeared in the doorway. She did not look surprised. She looked like someone who had been making a decision and had just heard a knock. I said, "I forgot my jacket." She sighed. "It's in the lost and found." I said, "I know." Neither of us mentioned the jacket again. She set down the brush she was holding. She turned the silver ring between her fingers once. Then she took it off and set it on the desk beside her. Not dramatically, just deliberately, and looked at me. She sighed. I've been trying to figure out how to say something for about 18 months, and I have not managed it once, which is unusual for me. So I want to try now while the light is good and you are here for a jacket. I said, okay. She said, the dinner. I didn't say what I said because I was being polite. I said it because I have been watching Dan do that for 2 years, and I have been watching you let him. And I am a person who teaches children that the work they do has value, and I could not sit there and pretend that the work you do doesn't. That's why I said it. She paused. But that's also not entirely it, she said. I said, I know. She said, you don't have to know anything right now. I understand that this is a strange situation. I understand the geometry of it. I am not asking for anything. He just wanted to say the thing that has been sitting very inconveniently in my chest for a year and a half, and now I've said it. She looked at her hands, at the ring on the desk, at me. I said, the geometry is strange. I am aware of the geometry, she said. Yes. I said, I've been aware of it for 2 years. I've been using it as a reason not to say something that I should have said a long time ago. She went still. I said, you have paint on your hands. She looked down. I always have paint on my hands. He said, I know. I noticed the third time we were in the same room. I notice every time. I don't know why I'm telling you that, except that we seem to be at the part where we tell each other things. Something in her chest moved. I saw it. She looked at me for a long time without speaking, which is unusual for her. She reached across the desk and picked up the ring and turned it once between her fingers. Then she set it back down. She sighed. James. I said, Ren. She said, the jacket's still in the lost and found. I said, I know. Do you want to go get coffee? There's a place near here that Marcus says is good, which means it's probably acceptable. She looked at me like a woman who has been holding something heavy and has just been offered somewhere to put it down. She said, yes. She picked up the silver ring and put it back on. She turned off the classroom light. In the corridor walking toward the car park, she said, you told those students about a mistake. I said, it was relevant. She said, everything you think is just useful information is actually the most interesting thing about you. You know that, right? He said, I'm beginning to think you might be right. She laughed. A real one, warm and unguarded, and the late afternoon light was still good, just as she had said, and she had paint on her hands, which was typical. And neither of us was in any particular hurry for the first time in a very long time. 3 months later, she framed something on my kitchen wall without asking. A small illustration, an architectural cross-section of a Victorian railway bridge, painted in the style she uses for her school prints, precise and worn at the same time. She hung it while I was making coffee. She stood back and looked at it and said, there, now your kitchen looks like someone lives in it. I said, someone does live in it. She said, someone interesting lives in it. A year after that, at the next Sunday dinner, different season, same lavender candle, same family. Dan looked at the two of us across the table with the expression of a man who has understood something he should have understood earlier and has decided the only dignified response is silence. My mother refilled everyone's glasses with the calm satisfaction of a woman whose plan has arrived on schedule. Ren caught me watching her notice all of this, and she turned the silver ring once and smiled. Not at the room, just at me. 2 years later, when people ask how it started, I say a Sunday dinner. She says a dinner, but the kitchen after is the part that mattered. She says this in the specific tone of a woman who knows she is right. She is right. The truth is that nothing had changed between us. She was still sharper than me, still quicker, still the person in the room who was paying the most attention to the thing that actually mattered. I was still the man who could explain a bridge and not a feeling until forced to. Nothing about us had changed, except everything had. Except now, when something went right, she was the first person I wanted in the room. And she had paint on her hands, almost always. And I had stopped pretending that wasn't the version of a Tuesday afternoon I preferred above all others. Nothing important had appeared overnight. It had simply stopped hiding. What would you have done if someone defended you at a family dinner, and it finally made you understand what they had been trying to tell you the whole time? And have you ever let the geometry of a situation be the reason you didn't say something that needed saying for far too long? Tell me your story in the comments. If you like this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.